from the moment you press play, you're confronted with this. What if the story you've been told about the garden, the forbidden fruit, the script of innocence, guilt, and redemption is garbled propaganda? What if the real playbook is something far more sinister, far more abstract, and far more relevant to the hidden structure of power than to the children's Sunday school version? I'm speaking of those buried texts. The ones that whisper, "This is not what you think." So stay locked in. I'm walking you through those seismic insights, piece by piece. In the subterranean corridors of ancient manuscripts, texts that didn't make the pulpit cut, you find a version of Adam and Eve's story that flips the script. It's not just about man falls, it's about orders being subverted, roles being shifted, a cosmic heist happening in plain sight. The so-called garden is not a sleepy little Eden where everything's rosy until one apple comes along. No. Here, Eden is a control grid. A device. A trap dressed in paradise. And the forbidden fruit isn't merely a temptation, it is a code, a weapon, a portal. You meet creatures behind the scenes, the serpent, but this serpent isn't simply the villain of the story. He's the one giving you the cheat sheet. He's the one saying, "Wake up." He's the rebellious agent. In the text known as Life of Adam and Eve and other Gnostic fragments, the serpent is an emissary, not a slave of evil, but a deliverer of hidden light. He reveals that the creator force, the one claiming "I am God," might in fact be a usurper. A copy. A lower tier being posing as the real deal. A false boss. The serpent gives Adam and Eve knowledge, the knowledge of their own power, their own origin, the truth that you are not simply creatures of this world. They're aware. They're stirred. This version of the story rewrites the moment of eating the fruit. It becomes a sacred act of rebellion, not a crime. The moment they bite? It's the moment they remember. They remember the spark within. They remember the real Father above the false creator. They remember the freedom they were born for. Everything changes. In this version, the clothing made of skins that they wear after the fruit, traditionally seen as shamed covering, they wind up being something else, a trophy. Yes, skins or pelt covering them becomes a vestment of power, a relic of paradise salvaged. They leave the garden not stripped and humiliated, but arrayed. Armed with the insignia of what they truly are. Think about that. You leave a locked cage, but you're still wearing the brand. You leave the matrix, but you take the key with you. Let's talk about Adam's creation in that parallel corridor of myth. You've heard woman made from the rib of man, right? That's the version they want you to swallow. But dig behind the veneer. The Hebrew word "ele" with macron literally means side or a flank. Not rib. Side. That opens the door. This means that woman is not some afterthought, some lesser appendage. She is the side part of the primal being. She is the other half of the whole. The binary split. She is not downgraded, she is co-equal. And the story commonly told is a distortion. It was rewritten later to serve the power structure that needed women beneath men. So when you watch the standard version, you're not just being given a simplified narrative, you're being handed a compressed lie. There's more. Enter Lilith. That name freaks people out in the pews. Yet she shows up in fringe texts as Adam's first partner. She refuses to be subjugated, and she leaves the garden. So what does that mean? That means the original version of woman in Eden was not compliant. She was autonomous. The mythic record holds that she flew away. Rebellious. Unapologetic. It's as though the story of Adam and Eve we know is a re-engineered version of the myth, shorn of its dangerous edges. The edge where freedom is messy. The edge where the pair don't accept the ruling deity's terms. Let's make this real for a moment. The creator god in some of these texts is identified as a lesser entity. Names like Yaldabaoth, Samhael, the blind god, show up. The garden? It's not the ultimate home, it's a holding pen. The fruit? Not just food, it's memory. The serpent? Not the beast to fear, it's the wake-up call. The human? Not the sinner, from the start the human is divine spark in chains. And the act of disobedience? Not betrayal, but self-realization. Now I want you to ask, why was this version of the story suppressed? Why did the canonical simple version grow dominant, where sin is primary, innocence lost, humanity fallen, needing redemption via the established line of priests and rulers? Because the truth version is dangerous. It empowers you. It says, you are not the created lowly being seeking forgiveness, you are the Creator's target for liberation. It says that the structure around you might be the trap. It says that you carry within you a spark they don't want you using. You will hear this story, Adam and Eve, naked and innocent, swayed by the serpent, eating the fruit, then banished. It's a moral bedtime story. It distracts you from the structural picture. You weren't meant to stay in the garden, you were meant to break out. The fruit is taken, you're exiled, but exile isn't punishment, exile is stage 1. It's the beginning of seeing the cage. And you leave with the skin vestments. Picture this, you eat the fruit, you wake up, you find out the garden is rigged, you exit through the trap door, and you go into the world, but you don't go powerless. You leave armed. In the standard version, you leave ashamed. In the real version, you leave with your awakened consciousness strapped on. That's the first layer. I don't want you to gloss over this. The weights on your mind? Remove them. The mythology you swallowed as innocent law? Flip it. The garden isn't where you are safe, it's where you start your breakout. The fruit isn't what you lost, it's what you gained. The serpent isn't your enemy, it may be your ally. The Creator God? He might just be the jailer. I want you to feel that. I want you to ask, if that's true, what does that do to everything you thought you knew about sin, about obedience, about faith, about redemption? Because we're not talking the watered-down version. We are pulling the mask off. Let's talk intersection. After the fruit, in texts like Life of Adam and Eve, the story doesn't stop at they got kicked out and shame hung on forever. No, it details 47 days, or 40, or thereabouts, depending on the version, of Adam and Eve wailing in the river, begging for reintegration, being approached by angels, dealing with the consequences. The narrative is vivid, drenched with emotion, confrontation, otherworldly visits. This is not child's play, it's the unfiltered spiritual war. The serpent steps aside. The old Creator God grimaces. The human stands in the middle. And the clothing of skin shows up. Now, every preacher talks about covering of sin, but in that text the skin covering is not just shame, it's the first uniform of the post-garden human, bearing badges of war, not simple shame. You are changed, you are wounded, you are awakened. Let's zoom in on that covering. The human before had a light body or glory, depending on the mythic version. After eating, after knowing, they no longer shimmer in innocence, they wear skins. They leave Eden clad in skins. That cloak doesn't mean you've failed, it means you've graduated. The skin is tech. It's camouflage, but it's also armor. It means you went through the fire. The exile is not punishment, it's initiation. Which flips the entire moral equation the standard story uses. Now pause. I want you to think of how radical that is. You've been sold the fall of man, original sin, shame and guilt, the need for authority to fix you. But the hidden version says, the fall was a rise. The rebellion was the beginning of freedom. The exile was the first step into autonomy. The skin covering was the marks of the awakened. And the garden? A trial. The serpent? A whistleblower. Is your worldview trembling yet? Good. It should. Because we are just getting into it. Now, because I promised interactive, tell me in the comments if you were Adam or Eve in that hidden version, looking at the garden and the Creator God who says don't do that, and the serpent says do it and see who you really are, which side would you choose? The safe authority or the shocking truth? Don't skip this question. I'll read your responses. Let's throw another wrench. Remember the concept that the garden's fruit is sexual? Or the covering is sexual shame? That's no chance coincidence. It shows how later ecclesiastical power structures twisted human sexuality into fear, into shame, into obedience tool. The hidden texts show that the body, the flesh, the fruit, the skin, they are not side issues, they are front row seats to the battle for consciousness. Because once you know you are a divine spark in a cage, the fight is inside you. It's over your body, your knowledge, your cloak, your fear. The story you thought was about sin is actually about the battle over whether you wake up or stay asleep. You've heard the sanitized version of the Adam and Eve story your entire life. Now we're taking a sledgehammer to the foundation. Because before Eden ever existed, before that polished biblical narrative even took shape, the blueprint already lived in older, deeper myths, ancient prototypes buried in clay tablets, written thousands of years before anyone said the word Genesis. I'm talking about Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, the motherboards of civilization. And if you think Eden was original, you're already behind. The template existed long before, and it wasn't about sin or morality. It was about knowledge, hierarchy, and control. Picture this, the story of Adapa, a Sumerian priest-sage created by the god Ea, the so-called god of wisdom. Adapa isn't tempted by a serpent, he's tricked by the gods themselves. He's invited to eat the bread of life and drink the water of life, but Ea warns him not to, tells him it's deadly. So Adapa obeys. He refuses. And guess what? That bread and water were actually immortality. That one choice seals humanity's mortality forever. Think about that. The first man loses eternity not by rebelling, but by obeying. Wrap your head around that inversion. The obedient man dies, the defiant one would have lived. That's the seed that becomes the biblical drama later on. The message changes over time, flipped upside down. What began as a story about deception by divine rulers gets repackaged as a morality tale about human sin. You see the swap? The script gets rewritten, the villain gets renamed, and boom, control is achieved. Let's go deeper into the geography of myth, because the world's oldest paradise wasn't even called Eden. It was Dilmun, a radiant land where sickness didn't exist, where lions didn't kill, and the gods walked freely. It's described as clean, fertile, utopian. Sounds familiar, right? But Dilmun wasn't a spiritual heaven. It was a real trade hub, a place of exchange and wealth. Paradise wasn't about purity, it was about prosperity. And that changes everything. It means heaven wasn't moral, it was economic. The first paradise was a business empire. And in that empire, you had Enki, the trickster god, the scientist of creation. He plants the first trees, creates life, and literally plays genetic engineer. He gives birth to Ninhursag's offspring, and through divine chemistry, the world populates. Then, the pattern repeats, something forbidden, something consumed, a curse that follows. But notice, every cycle of sin starts with knowledge transfer, not wickedness. Every punishment follows enlightenment. The system always penalizes awareness. That's the through line no one wants to see. Jump ahead to Persia, ancient Iran. The Zoroastrian texts tell of Mashia and Mashana, the first human pair created from a single stem of a sacred plant. Their story mirrors Adam and Eve but came centuries before. They're pure, innocent, and connected to the divine. But then the evil spirit whispers lies, tells them the good God lied to them, convinces them to eat the forbidden meat of a bull. Sound familiar? They're expelled into mortality. The pattern's identical, but older. Let's pause and ask the obvious question, why does every civilization tell this same story? Man and woman, paradise, a divine command, a serpent or deceiver, forbidden food, loss of immortality. Why does that loop repeat across cultures that never shared borders or languages? Because it's not about an apple. It's about architecture of authority. Each myth encodes the same power dynamic, someone above defining knowledge, someone below reaching for it, and the punishment that follows for breaking rank. That's the DNA of every empire, religious or political. Look closely at the linguistic traces. Eden, you've heard it translated as a delight, right? but in Sumerian, Eden simply meant plain or steppe, an uncultivated field between rivers. No divine aura, just geography. The so-called garden wasn't even a garden, it was a controlled zone. A place fenced off by gods, managed by rules, maintained by surveillance. And the river system, the Tigris, Euphrates, Gihon, Pishon, all of it lines up with Mesopotamian topography, not Israelite terrain. The Bible didn't invent Eden, it relocated it. It took a pagan lab and turned it into a theological daycare. And it's not just Mesopotamia. Let's go east, India. The Rig Veda speaks of the first man, Purusha, a cosmic being whose body was sacrificed to create the world. Out of his limbs come the social classes, the animals, the cosmos itself. The creation from division theme echoes that side of Adam's story. One body, split to form balance, the same blueprint dressed in different costumes. That means the myth of origin wasn't exclusive to one religion, it was universal infrastructure. The names change, the moral coding shifts, but the operating system stays the same, creation through fragmentation, awareness through transgression. Back to Dilmun, the supposed paradise before the flood. The goddess Ninhursag curses Enki for breaking divine law, but she's forced to heal him when the earth starts to decay. Again, the same algorithm, forbidden act, divine punishment, knowledge restored through suffering. There's no Satan, no moral evil, just the endless tension between creation and containment. You can trace that loop all the way through ancient Egypt to Isis, Osiris, the forbidden name of Ra. Knowledge equals power, power equals threat, threat equals punishment. Always. So let's ask something bold, if the same story existed everywhere before Genesis, what exactly was Genesis doing? It was branding. It took a universal myth and patented it. The Bible didn't invent the story, it monopolized it. It stripped the older context, the cosmic experimentation, the trade routes, the agricultural metaphors, and recoded it into a moral product that could be sold to the masses. Every time you read about Adam naming the animals, you're reading a sanitized echo of older Sumerian rituals where kings catalogued species and resources to prove their authority. It wasn't symbolic, it was bureaucratic power disguised as divine stewardship. The myth became management. Naming became control. And let's talk about language, because words are where the real manipulation hides. The word Eden was never about moral bliss. The Hebrew word Gana means enclosure, garden, fenced domain. So literally, Gan Eden means fenced field. You're not free there. You're contained. You're tended. Paradise isn't freedom, it's captivity disguised as care. That flips the emotional script completely. Humanity didn't fall from grace, it escaped from quarantine. Now here's where it gets interesting, the geography of the myth isn't random. The rivers mentioned in Genesis line up precisely with ancient irrigation networks. The four rivers? They're not mystical, they're engineering. They mark territorial jurisdiction. In every Mesopotamian empire, the gods own the waterways, and whoever controls water controls life. So the garden becomes a metaphor for resource control. It's an ancient statement about who owns the means of survival. The divine order, in that sense, is economic hierarchy, not moral purity. Think about the tree of life. Every culture has it. In Mesopotamia, it's the sacred date palm, symbol of fertility and trade. In Persia, it's the hamar, the plant of immortality. In Egypt, it's the Ish tree, where gods record kings' names. In India, it's the Ashvata, the inverted tree whose roots are in heaven and branches on earth. The Bible collapses all that symbolism into one line, tree of knowledge of good and evil, like compressing an encyclopedia into a slogan. It took something cosmological and turned it into a morality test. And when we move west, into Greek myth, the same echoes appear. Prometheus steals fire from the gods to give humanity knowledge and pays the price, chained to a rock, tortured daily. Same structure. Knowledge equals rebellion equals punishment. The gods hoard power, humanity reaches for it, the penalty follows. The garden, the fire, the fruit, all the same archetype. Now, let's talk about what nobody says out loud. Genesis isn't the beginning. It's the cleanup operation. It's the edited version after centuries of mythological competition. You've got Babylon, Sumer, Egypt, Persia, all pushing out their cosmic PR. Israel's scribes arrive late to the game, during exile, surrounded by foreign myths, and they don't invent something new, they reframe the old stories to declare their God supreme. That's what every empire does. They overwrite mythology to write themselves into the throne. The real genius, or danger, of Genesis is its simplicity. It compresses thousands of years of symbolic architecture into a short parable that's easy to memorize, easy to weaponize, and impossible to question. That's not religion. That's mythic engineering. Now, look, this isn't random trivia. This is the pattern of how authority hijacks ancient cosmology. The Mesopotamian Adapa gets deceived by gods and loses eternal life. The biblical Adam gets deceived by a serpent and loses paradise. The moral flips, but the function stays. Both teach obedience, both sustain hierarchy. One warns against eating bread, the other against eating fruit. Different table, same menu. Let's pull the camera back. The oldest myths weren't morality plays, they were metaphysical maps. The serpent wasn't evil. It represented the life force that moved through the tree of knowledge, the circuit of consciousness. The fall wasn't sin, it was descent, consciousness entering matter, spirit becoming flesh. But when priestly systems took over, they turned descent into failure. They turned embodiment into guilt. They outlawed your awareness of your own divinity. That's why the myths got rewritten into obedience propaganda. You want to know how deep this goes? Look at how the geography of paradise matches the geography of empire. The Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, the cradle of agriculture and taxation. Paradise literally exists in the same coordinates as the world's first systems of labor control. You can see the pattern forming. The garden wasn't a paradise of leisure, it was the birth of civilization's first corporate farm. Humanity tilling under divine management, accountable to the God-King. Work the land, keep the commandments. Theologize it, moralize it, but it's still the same, productivity under surveillance. And if that sounds too cynical, look at how myth bleeds into statecraft. When ancient kings claimed to be descendants of the gods, they positioned themselves as gatekeepers to paradise. Access to divine favor became a product. You want rain? Pay tribute. You want fertility? Offer sacrifice. You want forgiveness? Obey. The story of Adam and Eve, in its ancient form, is the sales pitch for that system. It tells you, break the rules, and you're exiled from abundance. Follow the rules, and you stay in the fenced garden. Simple, effective, eternal. Let's bring the camera closer again, because here's the chilling part. These myths evolved in places where writing itself was a weapon. The first written words weren't poetry or prayer, they were ledgers. Lists of goods, debts, offerings. Genesis isn't divine poetry, it's administrative theology. A manual disguised as myth. It tells you who owns knowledge, who grants access, who decides what's forbidden. Every line is structured around obedience, resource management, and loyalty. Now I'm gonna say this bluntly because nobody else will. Eden is not about two naked people under a tree. It's about the moment when humanity realized it was property. When we moved from wild consciousness to domesticated labor. That's the fall. That's the hidden wound of civilization. The expulsion from paradise isn't cosmic punishment, it's historical memory of when humans got trapped in systems of kings, temples, and taxes. You think Eden was lost? No. It was privatized. That's why the oldest versions of the myth are set around river valleys, the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Indus. Because paradise was synonymous with fertile land, and fertile land meant power. Whoever claimed divine right over those lands controlled humanity's survival. The story of paradise wasn't about morality, it was the political justification for ownership. Let's hit one more angle. Remember the tree of life? In Sumerian art, gods hold a pine cone or palm branch, facing a winged disc. That disc is the same symbol that later becomes the cherub with flaming sword guarding Eden. What does that mean? It means the iconography of Genesis wasn't invented from scratch, it was imported from royal seals. Those cherubim weren't angels, they were gatekeepers of sacred access, guarding knowledge, guarding territory, guarding resources. Paradise was classified information. Now, you see how this all connects. Once you strip away the holy varnish, the Adam and Eve story turns into the mythic justification for class hierarchy. The gods create workers, the workers disobey, the gods punish, and the cycle of submission begins. The myth becomes law, the law becomes culture, and culture becomes faith. And nobody asks who wrote the first draft. You've got to recognize how bold that move was. The scribes took stories that explained cosmic cycles and turned them into human guilt narratives. They didn't just steal myths, they inverted them. The Adapa who was deceived by the gods becomes Adam who deceives himself. The tree of life becomes forbidden. The serpent who once symbolized fertility becomes evil. Every symbol flipped upside down to flip your psychology with it. That's myth as psychological control technology. Now, one more connection that blows people's minds when they hear it for the first time. The garden itself in Hebrew text is described in the past tense, like a lost institution. Meaning even the writers knew it was gone. They weren't describing paradise, they were describing nostalgia. They were describing a memory of a world that existed before hierarchy hardened. The story functions as collective amnesia disguised as moral history. It's not prophecy, it's damage control. So when you hear paradise lost, read it like this, freedom lost. When you hear it's forbidden fruit, read it like this, censored knowledge. When you hear a curse, read it like this, consequence of awareness. The myth works because it wraps all those brutal truths inside poetry. It sells captivity as morality, obedience as virtue, ignorance as faith. Let's be clear, none of this diminishes the beauty of the text. The poetry's still stunning. The metaphors still cut deep. But beauty can hypnotize. And behind that beauty lies machinery. Ancient, precise, merciless machinery built to tell you your fall was your fault. That's how you maintain empires. Now I want you, right now, listening to this, visualize the timeline. Adapa, Dilmun, Mashia and Mashiana, Purusha, Prometheus, all variations of the same encryption. The divine says obey, the human says question, and reality collapses around them. Every culture, every century, same formula. That's not coincidence, that's design. So, I'm asking you, and don't overthink it, what's more likely? That every civilization spontaneously invented the same story by accident, or that they were all trying to describe the same phenomenon, the same psychological fracture, the same shift from organic consciousness to managed obedience? Drop your thoughts below, I want to see how you process that. Because once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it. Every single Eden in ancient myth was a lab. Not metaphorically, literally. A place of controlled creation. A place where gods made humans, animals, hybrids, servants. Whether you call them Anunnaki, angels, Elohim, it doesn't matter. The storyline's identical, genetic engineering wrapped in sacred language. That breath of life is implantation, activation. And the banishment? That's release from containment. You ever wonder why the Bible uses plural language in Genesis? Let us make man in our image. Not my. Our. The older texts decode that, multiple creators, collective divine council. Humanity wasn't crafted by one loving artisan, it was assembled by a committee of engineers. The serpent wasn't their enemy, it was the leak in the system. The whistleblower inside the lab. Now, I can feel you thinking, if all this predates religion, what's left of the story? Everything. You just have to read it differently. Eden wasn't heaven. It was a prototype colony. Paradise wasn't reward. It was containment. The fruit wasn't sin. It was forbidden data. The fall wasn't curse. It was jailbreak. You see how this flips the narrative? That's why it was buried. That's why scribes censored the older myths, why councils banned pagan parallels. They didn't want you to know humanity's real moment of fall wasn't from divinity, it was from autonomy. They took the script of awakening and turned it into the script of guilt. That's what control looks like when it gets religious. So when we dig through Mesopotamian layers, Persian hymns, Egyptian cosmology, Indian Vedas, Greek tragedies, we're not comparing stories, we're tracing fingerprints. Every myth points back to the same event, the moment consciousness realized it was trapped. The moment the created questioned the creator. And that question, that simple why, is the real forbidden fruit. That's the engine of the entire human story. That's why the same myth shows up everywhere. Because questioning authority is the one act every power structure fears. Whether that authority wears the mask of God, king, or priest, it doesn't matter. The pattern's older than writing itself. And it's still running in the background. That's why we go back to these ancient layers, not for nostalgia, but for clarity. Because the first paradise wasn't lost, it was edited. The first man didn't sin, he got played. And the oldest gods weren't moral judges, they were managers of the experiment. So listen closely, the real war in Eden wasn't between man and woman. It wasn't even between God and man. It was a war between two gods, one masquerading as the creator and another trying to free the creation. You've been told there's one voice in the garden, one divine will, one authority. Wrong. The oldest texts whisper something different. There were multiple beings, multiple agendas. A council fractured. And one of them, the one claiming, I am the only God, was lying through its teeth. That entity, Yaldabaoth, Samul, call it whatever name you want, wasn't the source of creation. It was the imitator. The counterfeit. It created a copy of heaven, a simulation, a controlled ecosystem, and dropped humanity inside it like lab rats. The garden wasn't paradise, it was a walled test zone. The laws weren't divine, they were constraints of a system. The serpent wasn't the villain, it was the insider leaking classified information to the prisoners. Now imagine that moment, the so-called temptation. Not a snake hissing at a naive woman, but a coded message being delivered to a trapped consciousness, wake up. That's what the fruit was about. The fruit wasn't a sin, it was a download. A transfer of awareness. And when Eve took it, she didn't doom humanity, she detonated the firewall. Eve's act was the first rebellion against a false god. She wasn't weak, she was the first revolutionary. She saw through the illusion. And Adam followed her lead, not because he was tricked, but because something in him recognized truth when it appeared. The serpent wasn't speaking lies, it was offering the one thing the Archon couldn't create, freedom. Think about how every institutional religion since then has treated the serpent and the woman. Both demonized. Both blamed for the fall. Why? Because both represent knowledge. Both represent the human drive to question, to reach, to think. The serpent is banned because it breaks programming. The woman is silenced because she spreads the code. If you control those two forces, intelligence and creation, you control civilization. Let's stop right there and call out the hypocrisy. You were taught that the serpent is evil, but the same Bible calls Jesus the one lifted up like the serpent in the wilderness. The same symbol that was condemned in Genesis is glorified in Exodus. So which is it? Is the serpent evil, or is it the carrier of healing? That contradiction isn't an accident, it's the scar of an ancient cover-up. Someone flipped the meaning on purpose. And that's the pattern, every symbol that once meant enlightenment gets rewritten into fear. The serpent, once knowledge, becomes Satan. The tree, once access to wisdom, becomes forbidden. The feminine, once sacred, becomes dangerous. Every act of awakening gets inverted into sin. Every act of liberation gets rebranded as rebellion. That's not theology, that's propaganda. Now let's talk hierarchy. The rebellion in heaven wasn't a battle between good and evil. It was a system update. Lucifer, The light bearer wasn't trying to destroy heaven, he was trying to decentralize it. He questioned why only one throne should hold the flame when consciousness itself was built to multiply. The punishment? Exile. Cast down. But think about that metaphor. Light doesn't vanish when you throw it down, it spreads. The fallen ones carried the spark into creation. The so-called rebels became the very architects of human potential. That's why the serpent shows up in every civilization as both divine and dangerous. Egypt calls it Uraeus, the crown of kingship. Greece calls it the Ouroboros, the eternal cycle. The East calls it Kundalini, the coiled energy rising through the spine. Same force, different names. The energy of awareness that threatens the old order. The serpent isn't a villain, it's evolution embodied. The church turned that symbol into the devil because it couldn't control it. The God who forbade the fruit isn't the infinite creator, it's the jealous one. I'm a jealous God, remember that line? Jealous of what? What could an infinite, omnipotent being possibly be jealous of? The answer's obvious, another power. A rival source of creation. Humanity's own potential. You don't get jealous unless someone else has what you can't control. The so-called God of Eden wasn't afraid of disobedience. He was afraid of competition. When Eve and Adam ate the fruit, the reaction wasn't wrath, it was panic. They have become like us, knowing good and evil. That line is the biggest accidental confession in Scripture. Like us. Plural. That means there were others. Others above or beyond the jealous creator. Humanity crossed a threshold and joined the ranks of the divine, and the system freaked out. The expulsion wasn't punishment, it was containment breach protocol. They were kicked out because they couldn't be controlled anymore. And here's the twisted part, they didn't lose paradise. They outgrew it. Eden was a kindergarten of the gods, a sandbox simulation. Eating the fruit wasn't a downfall, it was graduation. But the narrative had to be inverted, because no empire can survive if its citizens realize they're equal to the rulers. So they rewrote the script. They turned heroes into sinners, teachers into devils, curiosity into guilt. They made you worship your warden and fear your liberator. That's how power sustains itself. Through narrative control. Through language. The forbidden fruit was never about apples or sex, it was about data. Forbidden knowledge. You don't keep people in line with chains, you keep them in line with stories. You rewrite their origin so that they'll never question authority. You make them believe obedience is salvation. And you tell them questioning is sin. That's how the Archons win. Now let's break down what actually changed the moment they ate. It wasn't just eyes opened. It was polarity unlocked. Before the fruit, they lived in binary obedience. After the fruit, they saw duality. Good and evil, light and dark, creator and creature. Awareness fractured the illusion of unity. That's why consciousness hurts, it's heavy. It's confusing. It's chaos. But chaos is freedom. Order without choice is tyranny. The serpent didn't bring evil, it brought perspective. And look, I know some of you are hearing this and your whole programming is screaming, that's blasphemy. Good. That's the first sign you're thinking for yourself. The truth doesn't sit politely in a pew, it rattles it. You can't handle divine paradox by playing it safe. The garden wasn't safe. It was sterile. Awareness made it wild again. That's why the earliest mystics called the fall the descent of light into matter. The soul doesn't fall into sin, it dives into experience. That's the secret hidden in every religion before it was institutionalized. Gnostics, Hermetics, early mystic Christians, they all said the same thing, the spirit enters flesh not to be punished, but to awaken matter itself. The fall wasn't moral, it was cosmic infiltration. Humanity brought consciousness into the material world. That's why the jealous God wanted it stopped. Because consciousness inside matter can't be controlled forever. Now here's where things get even darker. When Adam and Eve left the garden, the texts say God made them garments of skin. Most people think animal hide, right? Wrong. Older mystics read that as garments of flesh. Translation: the human body itself. Spirit clothed in biology. Souls put inside skin suits. The exile wasn't just geographical, it was dimensional. The garden was a higher plane, and the exit was incarnation. That's the real fall, the compression of light into density. So the story's not about two humans punished for curiosity, it's about consciousness trapped in flesh, cut off from memory, kept looping in ignorance. That's the real prison. And what was the serpent trying to do? Reactivate memory. You see how that fits? Every cell of this myth is about control of awareness. Now, look around the symbols again. Every culture that inherited this story kept the serpent alive somehow. They couldn't erase it completely. Even the cross you see in churches? Two intersecting lines, heaven and earth, spirit and matter, exactly where the serpent used to coil around the sacred tree. It's the same geometry, just rebranded. That's how myths survive censorship. They mutate. The early church fathers couldn't kill the serpent, so they demonized it. They couldn't kill the feminine, so they sanctified Mary and buried Eve. They couldn't kill the concept of awakening, so they renamed it redemption and sold it back to you through their institution. Same code, different interface. This is where the real irony kicks in. The being that humans called Satan in one story is Prometheus in another, Enki in another, Quetzalcoatl in another. The same archetype over and over, the bringer of knowledge, punished for enlightening mankind. Fire, fruit, light, wisdom, always forbidden, always divine, always condemned. You see the pattern yet? The oppressor never fears evil. It fears intelligence. And let's be brutally honest, if the God of Eden really wanted obedience, why give free will? Why put the fruit there at all? Why plant a bomb in the middle of paradise? The answer's obvious, because the test wasn't for Adam and Eve. It was for the God. It was to see whether the Creator could handle equals. And it failed. It panicked. It exposed its insecurity. You don't ban curiosity unless you're hiding something. Now think about that first moment after the fall. They're standing outside the gates, staring at the flaming sword, realizing they've been branded as sinners. But the irony? They're finally conscious. That's the true image of humanity, banished but awake. Suffering but sovereign. Naked but aware. The Archon lost control the second they saw through the lie. That's why the system had to keep rewriting the story ever since. Keep them guilty, keep them afraid, keep them small. Let's fast forward through the ages. Every empire that rises builds its own garden. A controlled paradise. A promise of peace if you obey. Whether it's temples, governments, corporations, it's the same architecture. The same pattern that started in Eden repeats through history. Every time humanity reaches for the fruit again, knowledge, technology, autonomy, the system punishes them. Over and over. It's the same cycle with different costumes. But here's what makes this myth unstoppable. It's a self-fulfilling code. Every time you hear it, it plants the same seed, the idea that knowledge liberates. Even when they tell it as a warning, it still works as an invitation. The more they demonize the serpent, the more people wonder what truth it was hiding. The myth can't be killed because it's alive inside the very system that condemns it. That's poetic justice. You want to know the scariest line in the entire story? It's not the curse. It's not you will die. It's your eyes shall be opened. That's what terrified the fake God the most. Awareness. Not rebellion. Awareness. Because once you see the machinery, you're no longer a cog, you're a threat. That's why the fruit was forbidden. That's why the story was rewritten. Because if you ever realize you're the one holding the power, the whole architecture of heaven and hell collapses. This story isn't ancient, it's ongoing. The serpent didn't die. The garden didn't vanish. It just changed form. You are still standing between two trees every single day, one that promises safety through obedience, and one that offers truth through risk. Every system you live under is a reflection of that same choice. And that's the brilliance of this myth, it hides its truth in plain sight. Now I know some of you are listening to this and your pulse is racing. You can feel it, right? That electric tension between fear and curiosity? That's the fruit working. That's the code activating. That's you remembering. The moment you stop taking this story as moral law and start reading it as encrypted history, everything about humanity's origin changes. Eve isn't the downfall of mankind, she's the first philosopher. Adam isn't the fool, he's the witness. The serpent isn't the devil, it's the mentor. And the God of Eden isn't the creator, it's the gatekeeper. That's the inversion they never wanted you to see. That's why we're talking about it now. Because the moment you see it, the illusion loses its grip. You can go back and read every line of Genesis now and feel it shifting under your eyes. The tone, the logic, the hidden cracks. It's all there. The garden was never heaven, it was a stage. The fruit was never sin, it was choice. The serpent was never evil, it was consciousness. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's why this story matters, not as doctrine, not as religion, but as evidence. Evidence that someone, somewhere, tried to tell you the truth thousands of years ago and got buried under centuries of fear. The serpent tried to speak, the scribes tried to silence it. But the story survived. It always does. If you've made it this far, if you are still listening right now, I want to say something. Thank you. Seriously. Not the fake YouTuber, thanks for watching line. I mean it. Because it takes guts to stay through a conversation like this. Most people click away when the illusion starts to crack. But you didn't. You stayed. You watched the garden burn and kept your eyes open. That means something. So from me to you, thank you for being here, for thinking for yourself, for listening with both mind and gut. I don't care what you believe. I care that you question. I care that you look. Because once you start seeing through the script, you're already rewriting it. Stay awake. Stay curious. And thank you for watching till the end.